The consequences of Australia being as big as it is means that the land that it comprises of is divided into three distinct categories. These are the states, the internal territories, and the external territories. The external territories are often forgot about, as these are islands that are very sparsely populated compared to the mainland, and often don't serve any purpose other than being fun little trivia facts at pub trivia. Many of them are sparse of any history, with one notable exception, that is the Cocos Keeling Islands. Being close in Indonesia, having a population of only 547 people, and being the only territory of Australia that comprises of a majority Muslim population, many people don't seem to really think about its history. What these islands hide, however, is a very intricate and very unique history that many don't know that exists. Perhaps most notably was the fact that there was a second monarchy that ran alongside the British one up until the 1970s, meaning that Australia effectively had two functioning monarchies for up to 150 years. The dynasty would have humble beginnings in the style of John Cluny's Ross. Born in 1786 in Shetland, Scotland, he would begin his seafaring career at the young age of 13, joining the whaling industry. This would take him all over the world. That includes Greenland, the Baltics, but most importantly, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It was in Batavia that he decided to make a change after whaling for so long, and would encounter his friend turned foe, Alexander Hare. They would meet as John Cluny's Ross would volunteer to captain his ship, the Olivia, in modern-day Jakarta. Hare himself was the British resident at the settlement of Banjarmasin, and was practically the sole administrator for the entire island of Borneo at the time. In these Dutch-owned islands, however, Hare's practice of exploiting the local Malay people and using them for slave labour didn't attract much attention. He was a morally corrupt individual who sought to only further his own interests. After the 1824 Treaty of London, which meant that any British territories within the Dutch East Indies would have to be passed over to the Dutch, he was forced to pack up his bags and leave. And that's when he and John Cluny's Ross had the idea to go to the Cocos Keeling Islands, at this moment uninhabited, to set up for greener pastures. Hare would arrive in 1823, bringing with him 50 Malaysian slaves, while John himself would arrive 4 years later with a much smaller and a much more friendly landing party. Being 4 years late, Hare had essentially taken up the entire atoll, except for the South Island. As they both engaged in the copra business, copra being the flesh inside of a coconut which is bountiful in oil, Hare began to hemorrhage workers to John, as his mistreated slaves saw the conditions that John Cluny's workers had been set up in. John himself was very vocal about his disdain for Hare and his labour practices. While John had set up on the island to create a business and a life, Hare simply was there to make a quick buck. After a few years of hemorrhaging workers and business, Hare would then flee the island to Singapore where he would eventually die. Therefore, John would essentially inherit the islands as well as the workers and infrastructure left behind by Alexander. This meant that John had pretty much consolidated his rule of the island, as the Malay workers were happy to work under him and he was making enough money to sustain a living. When Charles Darwin visited the atoll in 1836, he would describe the natives as having a privileged life, in the way that they were treated compared to many other places across the world, but this was in 1836 where slavery was a widespread practice. Of course, however, John wouldn't live forever, and after petitioning both the British and Dutch governments for annexation, he would die in the year of 1854. Thus, the first succession of the island occurred, as the ownership of the island turned to his first son and heir, John George Cluny's Ross. This is where the ruling of the island gets a lot more boring. Not much happens from this point on, it remains a very stable and peaceful reign with a few hitches along the way. Born in 1823, John George would simply keep an eye on the domain that his father maintained. He was the first to be credited as the King of the Cocos by local Australian media, and would also be given the title of Tuan Padai by the workers, a tradition that would hold over in the many other successive rulers. Tuan Padai, as John George was a medical student, meant the learned one, thanks to his knowledge that he had obtained. John George would also start the tradition of marrying the local Malay women, who were mostly royals. He also doubled down on company rule of the island, creating the Cocos rupee, minted by him himself. This was only useful for company stores and had absolutely no recognition outside of the islands. The most eventful thing that happened during John George's reign was in 1857, when Captain Fremantle sailed to the islands on behalf of the British Empire and annexed them. In doing this, Captain Fremantle didn't wish to impede on the Cluny's Ross' absolute authority over the island, and in fact it's been heavily theorised recently that he actually thought he had arrived at the Cocos Islands of the Andamans, which were closer to India and Burma. For the next 14 years, nothing eventful would happen, where until 1871 John George would die and the crown would then be handed over to his son George. George was given the title of Tuan Tingi, and he had a very uneventful reign as well. In 1889, Queen Victoria would officially give the Clunies-Ross family a lease on the island for a symbolic 999 years, although the islands would fall under the jurisdiction of Singapore under the Straits Settlements in 1903. However, the absolute authorities of the family was undisturbed. George would die on the Isle of Wight in 1910, after going there to seek help after a sickness enveloped him. His next of kin would be John Sidney Clunies-Ross. In his absence, George had missed when a hurricane completely enveloped the island in destruction and wind, leaving a mess for John Sidney to clean up in 1910. The only part of the island to survive the cyclone was the Oceania House, which is the official residence of the Clunies-Ross. Otherwise, up to 90% of the coconut plants vital to the existence and survival of the island had been completely destroyed, and no houses remained. But the Clunies-Ross dynasty continued to do what it did best, help the island to recover and regain a foothold that allowed them to continue living life with the essentials. It's important to note, however, that the island never truly thrived, and was never a paradise to anyone but the Clunies-Ross. The Malay workers often lived a simple life, working the same job their entire lives under extremely strict rules. More often than not, the Cocos Malays were not allowed to leave the island, under the punishment of being barred from ever returning again should they step off somewhere else. Just because the conditions were serviceable compared to many others in the imperial world, it does not mean that the workers lived in a paradise. The island would become famous during World War I, when the German cruiser the Emden was sunk not far off its shores during the beginning moments of World War I, and is arguably one of the first moments of naval combat in the war. The islands would also play an important role in World War II, where the Allies turned it into an air base that helped them maintain control over the Pacific. The island's fate, however, is what would eventually kill John Sidney Clunies-Ross, as during a Japanese air raid in 1944, he would later be found dead. It's not clear, however, whether he died directly from the bombs, or of a heart attack due to the bombings. Thus, the leadership would pass on to its final king, John Cecil Clunies-Ross. Again, John Cecil would have a very uneventful and a very calm reign, and it wasn't until the late 1970s that the Clunies-Ross grasp of the island would finally be tested for the first time. During his reign, John Cecil would give a personal guided tour to Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip of the Islands, in the coming together of the two Australian monarchs, a rare and perhaps overlooked historical meeting. The next big event that happened was a UN mission to the Cocos Islands which described the conditions of the Malay people as feudal. During a time of decolonisation and anti-imperialism, this would lead to the Australian government in 1978 forcing John Cecil to sell the islands under threat of a compulsory acquisition. This deal, worth approximately 38 million Australian dollars today, also came with caveats for the government to fulfill, where they would be required to properly take care of the local Cocos Malays, which included upgrading the electrical infrastructure and sewage. After the deal, the Clunies-Ross would be allowed to stay in Oceania House along with 5 hectares of land. The island gained new democratic councils to run the island as well as the local copra business. However, all was not said and done for the Clunies-Ross family, as the government would be back 5 years later to deal the killing blow to the dynasty's rule on the island. Despite living without hassles, the government would forcibly and suddenly take away the Clunies-Ross's land on the island without compensation, with the intention of exiling the family forever. This created a strong public backlash, who saw the move as tyrannical and dictator-like. No matter how much the backlash existed, however, John Cecil wouldn't fight against it. He would move to the mainland in Perth, Western Australia, where he would go bankrupt after investing the money made from initially selling the islands into a shipping line company, which only lasted 3 years before failing. Him and the island would largely go their separate ways, until 1984 where a referendum was held for the Cocos Islands' full independence, where in a futile attempt to enact his legacy, he attempted to advocate for the island's full independence. However, the islands would instead vote for full integration with Australia, with 87.7% of the vote. John Cecil would still flaunt his title as the King of the Cocos until 2021, where he passed away, having never visited the islands again. The legacy left behind by the Clunies-Ross of the island is split between a public perception of good and bad. While some remember the days of a secure and safe life under the succession of kings, many also see the Clunies-Ross family as imperialists who exploited their labour for profits. Although, there is a strong consensus that the Cocos Malays were never mistreated and were always treated fairly by their rulers. Nowadays, the heir apparent still remains on the island as a clam farmer and lives a much more modest life than his ancestors. The island itself seems certain to a future as an Australian territory, when 75% of the island identifies themselves as neither Australian nor English. Today, it constitutes the only region of Australia with a Muslim majority. Thus, the tale of Australian second monarchy ends with a bang, a complicated tale that began with rivalry and ended in abrupt and sudden circumstances.